Okay, so we are set to begin second chapter of Tanya. So we gave the preface last week. We went through the whole Kabbalistic cosmology, not the whole, but we went through an entire discussion of Kabbalistic cosmology to give us a little bit of an idea, backgrounds for some of the concepts that we're going to be talking about. And then we'll, of course, always come back to them and reiterate them, so we know where we stand. And this chapter begins to talk about the Nefesh Elokit, the divine soul. So in the first chapter, the Alter Rebbe began his entry into the topic that he wants to discuss, namely a person's purpose in the world, especially as laid out in the Gemara, to be a tzaddik and not to be a rasha, to be a righteous person and not to be a wicked person. What exactly do these terms, do these designations represent? What is it that is being asked of the person that he be a tzaddik and not a rasha? So in order to understand all this, he prefaces and begins the first preface, which is the idea of there being two souls. So just to go back to the terminology, the language that the Alter Rebbe uses in chapter 1, he says that Rabbi Chaim Vital, who is the foremost disciple of the Arizal of Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, explains and teaches that each and every Jewish person, be they tzaddik, righteous, or however we are going to define that, and be they rasha, wicked, they have two souls. One soul, he says, is from the side or from the realm of klipa, of that which is unholy, the other side, sitra achara. So he calls that, so that's the first soul that he discusses. And he told us that this soul is the source of all the bad inclinations within a person. He talks about, again, drawing on the teachings of the Arizal, he talks about how the soul is composed or is based on the four basic qualities of fire, water, air, and earth, and that, of course, not the material fire, water, air, and earth, but their spiritual counterparts, and that the various negative inclinations, such as anger and arrogance, come from the element of fire. Lust and lusting after pleasures comes from the element of water, and so forth. So he gave us a little bit of what the result of this animal soul or animalistic soul, the soul that is animalistic in its orientation, being directed towards and being interested in self-gratification. And he also added that even good midot, even good characteristics that are natural for a Jew, such as compassion and loving kindness, also derive from this unholy soul, because they're not necessarily holy on their own, because this soul is a mixture of good and bad. It comes from its source is in the level that's called the mystery of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now he's going to go on to talk about the second soul, and the second soul is the divine soul. So a person might ask that this seems to be a counterintuitive ordering of the discussion of these souls. You would think that the soul that really should occupy our focus, and actually does occupy our focus, but should take precedence as far as understanding ourselves, understanding our purpose, and understanding our relationship with God should be the godly soul, should be the divine soul. And that should be discussed first. And not only is it discussed second, but it's actually referred to as the second soul, as if it's the afterthought. So why refer to it as the second soul? Let's actually read the first line of the second chapter inside, and then we'll discuss it. So he begins, "Benevesh hashenit b'Yisrael," the second soul in Israel, the second soul among the Jewish people. He chelak Eloka mimal mamash. This is a part of God from above, mamash. Mamash means literally. So let's unpack this line. So, actually, if we go back to the more familiar, perhaps, terminology that is used in the Gemara as well, and the Talmud as well, and certainly in the books of Musar, the books of piety that discuss the inner workings and the inner struggles of man, and how we deal with refining ourselves, elevating ourselves, and rising above baser natures. When they talk about Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Hara, the good inclination and the bad inclination, Yetzer literally means like a nature, like the way that somebody was created. Right? Like it says that by Yitzer Hashem Elokim et ha'adam, God formed man, God created man, dust from the earth. So there's two ways that God formed us, two Yetzers, two ways that He created us, two natures that He gave us. One is a bad nature, one is a good nature. So the Talmud, in interpreting a verse in I believe it's in Proverbs, says that a child who is poor, wise, is better than a king who is old and foolish. And the Gemara explains that the child who is poor and wise is a reference to the Yetzer Tov, to the good inclination, and the old and foolish king is a reference to the Yetzer Hara, to the evil inclination. Why is the evil inclination called an old and foolish king, and the good inclination is called a child who is wise? Because the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, enters into us much earlier than the good inclination. The evil inclination enters into us at birth. The good inclination enters into us at the time of bar or bat mitzvah. Now, it's not the case that a person is a total animal until bar or bat mitzvah. It's not the case that they're not Jewish, they don't have the Jewish soul in them until bar bat mitzvah. It's not true. Or that this soul is somehow not inside of them. But as we're going to see, the animalistic soul / Yetzer Hara is associated with the heart, with the emotions, and the godly soul, the divine soul, is associated with the mind. And the idea of coming to a level of intellectual awareness is associated with being bar mitzvah. Until then, right? That's why we say that the child is not obligated to keep the commandments because they lack dots, they lack awareness. We often translate as knowledge, but in this context, the better translation would be awareness. It's not that the kid doesn't know; he's gone to school and learned plenty of things, but the child lacks awareness, lacks a sense of empathy in a way, right? Sometimes kids can be really cruel to each other because they don't fully appreciate, what their actions, how it might be hurting somebody else. Like as you get older, you begin to have more of an appreciation of that. And that's something that begins at the age of puberty. At the time when a person begins to mature, they begin to change in their awareness as well. Uh, uh, Children then begin to become more interested in why, in what's behind, in how do we understand life. Like until then, they're more caught up in rules. Is it according to the rules or is it not? Is it fair or not? Right? But that's what we tell them. It's not fair. Tough luck. But as they enter their teenage years, they begin to start thinking about things in a more uh, you know in a more developed way, in a more trying to understand, starting to care about things that they're learning about. So, so the divine soul is associated with the mind, and that's something that only comes into, begins to really play a part in the child's life and psyche as they get older. It doesn't begin at age 12 or 13. It begins much sooner. So the Alter Rebbe writes in his Shulchan Aruch, in his code of Jewish law, that the beginning of the entry of the Holy Soul into the person is at the Brit, or for a girl, it'll be at the naming of the child, which is why the naming of a girl should be done at the first opportunity. That's the beginning. Now they have a Jewish name. Now they have a Brit. They have a covenant with God. We just celebrated the first haircut of a young boy today. That's the beginning of the age of chinuch, of education, of training, to teach him to keep on, to wear tzitzit, and to make his blessings and some of the prayers. We begin to expect more of the child at that age. And as they grow, they continue to learn more and to develop. And then by the time that they're bar bat mitzvah, they are at a further stage when we can begin to expect them to take responsibility for keeping all the mitzvot. So chronologically, the divine soul is second because it comes later. It's always there. It's there at the time of birth also, but it's not revealed in the body fully, or it becomes revealed in stages, but later on. Whereas the animalistic soul, the Yetzer Hara, that's there from the get-go. The child is wants and is, going after what it wants. So that's one one explanation. But on a deeper level, another thought on this: why the divine soul is called the second soul. And I think that this is an idea that really has a very powerful point to it. Is that ultimately the goal is, the objective is, that the divine soul should be the teacher, the trainer of the animal soul, to bring the animal soul into the service of God, to refine it, to elevate it, to transform it. And therefore, in the when we talk about the divine soul, when we talk about the godly soul, we call it the second soul because ultimately it's supposed to be two souls. Its purpose is not to be by itself, but to be a soul together with the animal soul. That both should be there. There is a both they complement in the ideal situation, in ideal circumstances. where they're actually working together, they complement one another, because the divine soul uh, has a perspective that is godly. It looks at the world from a godly lens. Its orientation is towards God. But it's in some ways a weaker force. The animal soul is a stronger force, right? It's got passion, it's got drive, it's it's aggressive. So, but the ideal is, if you think about a human and an animal, right? Humans were very smart, but we're much weaker than the animal. You take an ox or a lion, or they have tremendous energy. If a person in the age before tractors, if a person wanted to plow their field, you could do it by hand, but it would take a lot of effort, a lot of energy, and a long time. If you could harness an ox and get it to pull the plow, you can plow your field much more quickly, much more effectively, because it has so much strength. So, metaphorically, we want to harness the animal soul and thereby have that much more of a yield and that much more produce spiritually in our godly life, than we would with the divine soul itself. So we look actually the Mishnah in Brachot, the very first tractate, says in the last chapter, it says that when the Torah tells us v'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, you shall love Hashem your God b'chol levavcha, with all of your heart. So the Mishnah interprets this. That means b'shnei yitzrecha, with both of your yitzers, with both of your natures, with your good nature and your evil nature. You have to love God both with your good nature, with your yetzer tov, as well as with your yetzer hara. So, how exactly that works? One way is the way that we're talking about here, that the godly soul has to become the trainer of the animal soul, is to teach it that you want what's good for you. You know what's the best thing for you is to have a relationship with God. You want what's most pleasurable to you. You know what would be the highest pleasure? It would be for you to understand Torah, to understand God, to feel a love for God. It would surpass anything that you think you're getting from the physical pleasures that you run after. And the animal soul is like it's like a desire machine, and it projects desire. So it projects desire on everything that it sees, right? It's the science of advertising. You walk into a department store, and they have it set up in a very calculated way that you should realize that you really, really need this item, right? So you didn't know you needed it before, but you know you need something, and you walked in there, and they convince you that that's what you need, right? So the godly soul says to the animal soul, that's not what you need. You're projecting desire, but really, you would get what you're looking for even more so from holiness. So in a sense, when the Alter Rebbe refers to the divine soul as the second soul, he's making a very basic and crucial point here, and that is that when we look at the physical existence that we're in, we look at least the possibility of sin, the idea of God's concealment. And this is something that people have thought about for thousands of years. But very often, the way that it's portrayed and the way that it's looked at is as a problem. We're in a fallen world. We're in a kind of it's like a mistake, right? You had Adam and Eve, they were in the garden, and they just couldn't, like, something about that tree was so tempting that they messed it up for all future generations. And then we really have to get back to that Eden. So, I mean, it's definitely a very strong idea in Christianity. There are some parallels in Judaism as well, certainly. Uh, But what is that saying? That's saying that we were supposed to be going on this track, right? And that got derailed, and now we're going over the cliff, and we're in trouble, and somehow we have to get back there. So, and then you'll have different, different degrees of how to salute that. So some philosophies will say that we have to try to escape this world. You can start with with death cults, uh, but even uh, those that advocate for a life of asceticism, living a simple life, denying yourself, and locking yourself away from the world. Uh, others who say, look, we shouldn't be here, but now that we're here, we got to make the best of it. So, whatever, we lead productive lives, but really, the real place is to get to heaven. And the Alter Rebbe, again, he's not inventing these ideas, but he's certainly giving them emphasis and putting them at the center of his thinking, is telling us that this world is where it's at. This is really what it's all about. God took a piece of himself, chelek elokah, a piece of God from above, and sent it down into this world and placed it within a frail, uh, human body with all of its sometimes even repulsiveness. And why did he do that? For the body, for the animal soul, not for the divine soul, not because the divine soul needs it, but because this world needs to be enlightened, and that's really our job. And God wants to have a dwelling place in the lowliest realms. God wants that the darkness of this world should be transformed into light that will create a light that is beyond any light that we can have up in heaven. So that is already being alluded to in his reference to the soul as being the second soul. That is the soul that has to go together with the animal soul. There's a verse in Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs. It says, "Mashcheni, draw me, acharecha narutza." After you, we will run. Right. So the Rebbe's note that there's a change in number. Right. First says, "Draw me." That's one, and then says, "We will run after you." So the Alter Rebbe explains that the divine soul says, Mashcheni, says to God, draw me closer to you, and we will run after you. I will get the animal soul to run after you as well. And because I will get the animal soul, it will be running. Like I was saying before, that it has much more energy. So it'll be with tremendous tremendous energy, with tremendous gusto that we're going to go after you. Okay. So he describes this second soul as chelek elokah mimal mamash, a part of God from above, literally. This is can be a pretty shocking statement. Michael already raised the issue of saying that there's a piece of God within us that can border on some questionable ideas of saying that God can dwell within man. Incarnation. So the phrase chelek elokah mimal comes from the book of Job, the book of Iyov. In Job he says, "Ma chelik elokam mima'al," like what godly portion from above can I expect, or something like that. So it's words. In the Kabbalists, as they do, will take phrases from the Torah and they will interpret them in completely different ways, out of the context of out of their original context. Although arguably sometimes that actually sheds light on what the verse is saying, but they'll read much more meaning into it. So the idea that the soul is called chelik elokam mima'al, a part of God from above, is found in the disciples of the Arizal, of Rabbi Yitzchak Luria. So presumably it originates with him, although I don't know exactly how we differentiate what is from him and what is from them, but we find it in. There's a book called Reshit Chochmah by Rabbi Eliyahu Dividas. He was a disciple of the Arizal, and he talks about, he states this explicitly. I mean, a lot of what we're going to be reading here in this first part actually comes from, is there in Shilcha. Yeah, and so and we're gonna have to unpack this idea of what does it mean when we talk about it as a part of God. What exactly are we saying about the soul by describing it in this way? Alter Rebbe adds the word mamash. That is Alter Rebbe's contribution to this idea. He says, mamash, literally, it's actually this way. There are times when there are statements or things that are said in the Torah that are somewhat exaggerated. The Talmud itself says sometimes that scriptures have spoken using exaggerated language, right? For example, the spies came back from Israel and they said, we saw great fortified cities up to the sky. It wasn't actually up to the sky, it's high, but so scripture spoken using exaggerated language. So that's what Alter Rebbe wants to say, that say that the soul is a part of God from above. It's mamash. It means that literally. And what does that actually mean? The Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Rebbe, Rebbe Shalom Dober, said that the term mimal, from above, points to the highest of spiritual levels. And the word mamash expresses and connotes the most physical, because mamash is something tangible. It's not just something in our world. Light is something we experience. Sound is something we experience, but it's not, you can't touch it in the same way you can touch something, really tangible. And here he marries these two terms together to say that the soul, as lofty as its source is, it comes from the loftiest levels, it affects the real physical reality, the everyday life, the lowest level. So we shouldn't think of it as being something that is just kind of a vague influence in our life, something that you would refer to in Tanya as surrounding, transcendent, something that is not directly involved in my existence. This part of God is something that is in our bodies. It is part of what's pulsating through our bodies. We have certainly our animal soul, but we have the godly soul that is in there and is affecting us in a very direct and immediate way. So that's what he's saying about this. So this actually, again, has a very important outcome and conclusion from it, which is that we often underestimate ourselves as far as what we're capable of accomplishing. We limit ourselves. We look at ourselves as being dust from the earth. But really, within us, we have a piece of God. God is unlimited, especially when it comes to matters of Torah and mitzvahs. Might encounter challenges that we think are insurmountable. You know that you have a part of God within you from above. There's nothing that stands in his way. And that's within us. That's something that can be actualized in our lives. Okay, so now the Alter Rebbe is going to begin to. He's going to complete the. He brings the proof text, which again is found in the earlier sources as well, and then he's going to explain more in the next part what this means. So I'm going to read now until what's called the two dots, the colon. I don't know if you have that in your prints, and then we'll come back and we'll unpack what it says. Okay, so he cites a number of proof texts. The first proof text is from the Torah, from the book of Bereshit, of Genesis, as it is written, "Vayipach be'apav nishmat chayim." He blew into his nostrils a neshama, a soul of life, or a breath of life. Okay, so that's the description of the creation of Adam, that God created the man afar, dust from the earth, and he blew into his nostrils a breath of life, and the Adam became a living soul. That's what it says. What does it mean that he became a living soul? We'll talk about that in a moment. So, but the Torah uses the metaphor of blowing. God blew into Adam's nostrils, and he became a living being. So what is being suggested by this metaphor? The Torah is very precise. Every word in Torah is precise. And if Torah chose to describe God's infusing man with a soul using the metaphor of blowing, then there's something significant about that. And this is highlighted by the contrast with the way that the Torah describes the creation of all other creations. Because with regard to the rest of creation, it says how God spoke. God said, and they came into being. Even the fish and the animals and the birds, it doesn't say that God put a soul in them. It says God said, let there be marine life, and the water swarmed with life. God said, let there be land animals, and there were living land animals that came into being. It wasn't, it doesn't talk about blowing or anything like this. It's just God spoke and they became. So why this matter? So that's what he's going to begin to explain now. Now he cites a second proof text. Ve'ata nafachta. So this is a proof text from the Siddur, from our daily prayers. In the morning, when a person gets up, the first prayer, although it's not the first prayer in the Chabad Siddur, but it's the first prayer according to the Talmud, is to say, Elokai, my God, Neshama shenatata bi, the soul that you placed within me is pure. You created it, you formed it, you blew it into me. Ata nefachta bi. You blew the soul into me. So a person might say, Torah, when it says that God blew the soul into Adam, it's talking about the first man. He was a very lofty being. He was created directly by God. The rest of us are happies. Who says that this metaphor applies to us? So the answer is that each one of us says, Atana fachta bi, you blew the soul into me. Each one of us has a soul that has been blown into us by God. And what is the significance of this metaphor of blowing? This is clarified by the next citation, which is from the Zohar. as is written in the Zohar, Man denafach mitochei nafach. One who blows from within themselves. And the Alter Rebbe explains, Perush, this means, mitoch yuto, from his inwardness, v'toch, umipnim yuto, and from deep within, from inside, internality. Shetoch yut, upnimiyut, hachayut sheba'adam, the innermost life, energy, vitality within a person, motzi, the person emits, benefichato bekoach, by blowing with force. So he's highlighting the distinction between blowing and speaking. When it comes to speaking, we also use our breath. We have to expel some breath in the course of speaking. But it does not take nearly as much energy as when we blow. A person can speak for hours. If you've ever tried blowing up balloons, right? You can do it for a few minutes, and then your head's beginning to spin. Because when you blow, it's a much more internal level of energy, of life that you're putting into it, that is far deeper than that which comes out when one speaks. So with regard to the rest of creation, the Torah describes it as speech. The Torah says that God spoke the world into being. It's coming from within God. God's creation, God's creative power. The power to create is found only with God alone. There's nobody else that has the power to create. But it's somewhat external, similar to a person speaking. Whereas when it comes to Adam, it comes to putting the soul, the divine soul that he's talking about over here, into man, he says that it's that vayipach papav, he blew it into his nostrils, and he blows it into each one of us, that it's the inwardness of God's energy, a very deep level of God that is being placed within us. And that's why he refers to it as chelek elokam imal mamash, an actual piece of God from above. We still have to explain what exactly that means. He's going to go on to talk about that in the next part. But this is where he makes the case, right? He gives us the proof texts to show that the divine soul is qualitatively different from all other aspects of creation. It's like God himself, God blew himself into Adam's nostrils. Okay. So a few things over here. First of all, I want to quote a little bit from the commentary of Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachmanides, on this verse that God created man as dust from the ground, that he blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Which really, as we'll see, a lot of what the Alter Rebbe is saying here is actually, resonates with what Ramban says. So Ramban says as follows. He says that the Torah in this verse mentions God's full name. It says Hashem Elokim. So it uses both names of God. Created the man as dust from the ground. So it's showing that the source of the soul is from God himself. And he says he blew it into Adam's nostrils, telling us that this soul is not a result of material processes, and it's not a soul that's derived from the level of the angels. It was the ruach, the wind spirit of the great name of God himself, from whose mouth emerges knowledge and understanding. This is he's paraphrasing a verse in the Tanakh. In other words, that this breath that God is blowing into Adam is not merely wind, but it is knowledge and understanding. It is a soul. It's what endows man with intelligence. He says, for when one blows into another's nostrils, he inserts of his own soul. And he says, this is what Job means when he says the neshama of the Almighty, Shakai, gives them understanding. The soul that we have comes from God, from God's name. He uses one of the names of God there, and that's what gives us understanding. And he goes on to talk about how, in his opinion, although there's different ways of looking at it, but in Ramban's opinion, when God formed Adam as dust from the earth, he wasn't just a dead clod of earth. He was able to move. He was alive. He was a living being, kind of like a golem, right? Like a zombie. He lacked intelligence and speech. It was this act of blowing the soul into him that endowed him with intelligence and speech. It made him fully human. Which kind of parallels what we're talking about over here about there being two souls, right? There's the kind of the earthly soul that allows the first Adam to just to live, to eat and digest and whatever, do the bodily functions. And then afterwards comes a higher soul, which is God blowing the soul into. But we see in Ramban's description already, he's saying that it's the ruach of the great name. It's coming from his mouth, and that's why we have intelligence, because it's coming from within God. God is the ultimate intelligence, and he's endowing us with his qualities by blowing his wind, his piece of himself into us.
If speech and intelligence are exclusive to the godly soul, where do non-Jews get it from?
That's where I thought you were going. That if speech and intelligence come from the godly soul, then and the godly soul is exclusive to Israel, then it wouldn't exist with the non-Jews. So he's not saying exactly the same thing, right? First of all, Adam was the ancestor of all people, and we all have the human qualities of speech and of intelligence, Jew or non-Jew. And that's not what the Alter Rebbe is saying. The Alter Rebbe here is not saying that because of the soul we have speech and intelligence. So he's not. There are parallels with the Ramban. It's not exactly the way that Ramban is saying, and Ramban is not saying that this is something specific to Jews either, right? So yeah. So there is they're not exact parallels. I would say that there are degrees. To call it chelik elokam imal mamash, an actual part of God from above, that is something that is specific to the Jewish people, whereas the animalistic soul, which already has built into it intelligence as well and speech and all that, it has that from God, but at a further remove. So we wouldn't be able to say about that mamash, that it's actual, divine spark that's being directly inserted into the body in that case. Okay. So just one other comment. It's a very interesting thing, and we come across this from time to time, and particularly with regard to this line. The Alter Rebbe quotes it a number of times throughout his thoughts, citing the Zohar that one that blows from within. So we do not have, at least in the Zohars that we have, this line is not found. It is found in other Kabbalistic works. It is at least the concept is there in the words of the Ramban. He said, when one blows into another's nostrils, he inserts of his own soul. So the idea is there. In other words, why it is that the Alter Rebbe cites it from the Zohar, and this is not the only place that he does that, is an interesting question. Maybe he had some a version or manuscript or something where this line was in there, it's hard to know. It is a case that he does cite it from the Zohar on more than one occasion, so I think it's not a typo. It's somehow he associated with the Zohar. Okay, okay. I think we'll stop here for today. Although, did I? Oh, you're asking about the Ramban. About the Rambam.
Yeah, the Rambam says one of the 13 principles is that God doesn't have a body.
So I'm not saying that God has a body in this case in the way that the Rambam is negating. We're not God's body. We're human bodies. We do have a body. When Rambam talks about the idea of the image of God, he is very unequivocal that it doesn't mean that he would not agree with using the word image to translate the word tselem Elohim. He says tselem doesn't mean image. It means basically the qualities of God, intelligence. That man is endowed with intelligence. That was the special way, the unique way that God created human beings, as opposed to other animals where they don't have the tselem Elohim. They don't have that divine tselem. Term image, I think that there's probably good reason to translate tselem as image, but I think it's the very first issue that he deals with in the God for the Perplexed is to go through a whole linguistic thing to explain that the word tselem, that the word for the image of a person is toar. It's a different word. Tselem means this divine imprint, this higher. There's not even DNA. It's this intelligence which is seen as something divine, and the fact that we have it is because God endows us with it. It's not completely natural to us. Yeah, it would be like if we were to talk about say a parent who's known for a particular talent, and then they have a child who is also quite capable in the same way or in a similar way, that we might talk about them as being somehow a copy of their parent. We're not talking about their features. We're talking about higher abilities. So that's how the Rambam would talk about Tselem Elohim. But as far as the body is concerned, talk about God having a body. What the Kabbalists do, and we see this, in Hasidic thought a lot, is to kind of reverse the whole question and to say that the fact that we have a body and the characteristics of our body all derive from God. So I've been thinking, I've been trying to figure this out for some time, of what the Rambam's issue with talking about God having a body is. Like, why is he so adamant that this is not only wrong, but it is a fundamental principle? It's one of the 13 fundamental principles in Judaism. He says that he has no body. That somehow, if you believe that God has a body, you're a heretic. And recently, we just started the Rambam again, and he discusses it in the first chapters. And I believe that he associates this concept with the belief in one God. That if God were to have a body, that would mean certain limitations for him. He would have some kind of boundary, and then there would be, outside of that boundary, would be some other God. If you believe that God is one, then you have to believe that God is everything, that he's infinite. Okay, but I think that it's also important to talk about the other side of this, which is in the Torah and in the Talmud and in the Midrash, God is described in very anthropomorphic terms. It's undeniable that we find throughout, both physically, and the Rambam deals with this. We talk about God's eyes, we talk about God's speech, we talk about God's hands, we talk about God's heart, God's mouth, and we also talk about characteristics such as being happy or being angry or these kind of things, right? That's 100%. Nobody has read any amount of Torah and not come across this. Likewise, in the Talmud, very interesting and enigmatic stories, and we talk about God smiling and God nodding his head. Moshe sees the back of God. Well, the Torah says that Moshe saw the back of God. The Talmud goes even further and says that God showed him the knot of his tefillin, and says that God puts on tefillin. God has a head, God has an arm, he puts tefillin on his arm, puts tefillin on his... What? So why do they talk about God that way? In other words, there is, even as we want to make sure to negate any kind of limitation and any kind of image from God, there is a significance and there is an importance to talking about God in these terms. And just briefly, and I think we'll definitely have more occasion to talk about this as we go through Tanya. At the same time that we want to negate from God any kind of human characteristics, we also do not want to lose touch with God. God has to be a God that we can relate to. And arguably, and I think people actually did argue this about the Rambam and about the Jewish philosophers in general, that by making God such a kind of distant and transcendent being, people actually felt like they couldn't have any connection with God, and that led to all kinds of trouble. There are those who so the Rambam died in, I believe it was around the year 1205, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. That next century, the 13th century, is the time when Kabbalah becomes a thing. Mysticism existed before that, but specifically referred to as Kabbalah, and the particular systems that are used in Kabbalah are spoken about by rabbis that live, if not already during the lifetime of the Rambam, soon afterwards. And so there becomes these kind of two tracks, the philosophical track and the mystical track. And then, and this is again, especially in the Islamic countries, especially in Spain, let's say, Zohar comes out in Spain, and there are many other Kabbalistic books that are written then. And then in 1391, as Spain is becoming more and more Christian, so at that time there were pogroms against the Jews, and there were a lot of forced conversions, and that's where all of the fake converts, the Jews who converted, supposedly, just so that they should be able to save their property or their lives or whatever it is, begins then. It didn't begin at the time of the Spanish expulsion. It began a century earlier. And so there was a whole century of the Spanish Christians suspecting Jewish converts. Do they really mean it, or are they still Jewish? Because a lot of them were actually still Jewish. But some rabbis blamed the conversions on philosophy. They said, because they put God too far away from people that they now, you can okay, whatever the validity of that claim is, that's a kind of extreme claim, but let's at least say that the emphasis in Hasidus is again, not to deny or to uh, not to deny this idea of God not having a body and being unlimited and all of this, but to emphasize how God is connected to us, how God relates to us, even in what we study today, talking about God blowing the soul into Adam. So, of course, we explain the metaphor, and we're not saying that God literally, took a great wind from his lungs and expelled it into Adam's nostrils, but there is something being said there, and saying that our bodies house a godly element, and in this way we have a sense of the immediacy of God, a sense of God being very close to us and being somebody that we can talk to and we can interact with and we can have a relationship with, and that's the theologically, right, as far as our beliefs, it's important to know and to understand and to appreciate and to negate corporeality from God, physical or even not only physical characteristics, but even kinds of characteristics that come about from being physical. But for the soul level, the heart level of serving God, we also need to have a sense of God's immediacy. And the Alter Rebbe is very much, a follower of the Rambam. He will not, he will not argue with the Rambam on these points, and he brings them up in Tanya and elsewhere as well. This idea that God has no body or bodily form is something that's quoted quite often in the Alter Rebbe, but he does strike a kind of balance between this kind of insistence on negating corporeality from God and explaining that these expressions, these metaphors, these terms that are used when we talk about God's hands and God's eyes and so on and so forth, have validity and have importance. Like they tell us something positive about God. That's equally important. Okay,